Well, welcome to week one of spring semester. I'm glad that you're here learning with me and following along with me on this. This semester is going to be a really fun one. A lot of more technical stuff that we're going to get to this semester, but some really cool concepts we've even already discussed this week. So in my senior seminar, the readings class, it's called senior seminar, but it's more of like how can we learn to evaluate writings, basically. How can we read something and evaluate what's going on? So we've learned a little bit in some of the writings about the difference between a literary research and historical research. So literary research is where you are trying to understand the the history of what you're reading by looking at the linguistics. What does it actually say? What does it imply? What are the meanings they try to give back in that day? So it would be looking at the scriptures from a standpoint of what did the old Hebrew actually say? And then how can we evaluate it and work with that? That's more of a literary way to look at history. What did they mean when they said what they said? How did they phrase it? How did they put it together, basically? A historical evaluation would be looking at what was happening and what was happening around it as well. So, what did this story mean to the people at the time? That's more of a historical research perspective. So, there's different methods that are used when evaluating history that we can look at. And that's what we talked about in that class, is some of these other methods and ideas. So one of the things that we're evaluating is the book of Genesis. I've talked about in the past. If you want to watch those past videos, we're reading a book called Genesis. It's a newer translation from the Hebrew language or the Hebrew version, and it's really cool. I'm learning a lot from this. One of the things that I've learned as we're starting to get into this book of Genesis and understand it better is realizing that, from my perspective at least, I think we as English readers of the Bible are getting totally gypped. We are missing so much of the Bible that's just not there. It's there in the other translations, but not in the English. Part of that is just how English is constructed versus how, like, ancient Hebrew is constructed. So you have to realize that when you are translating from one language to another, there are often limitations that come in. One language can be more expressive than another, and that's going to change how you look at things. Now, this author talks about in his book that the ancient Hebrew is way more expressive, a lot more emotions and feelings put into it. Whereas when you get to English, there's not as much, especially the more modern English translations. The Bible stories become more of a transaction than an experience. And this is one of the changes that happens. And so we want to, the more we can look at these old languages and get back to more originals, the more we can put some of that back in there. So he gives an example here. I want to read this to you just so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. So this is the story of Rebecca when she is at the well, and the servant, remember, is there to fill the servant's coming to find a wife, basically, for Isaac, if I remember right. It was Isaac, yeah. And so he meets her at this well, and she fills up the pots and gives him water and gives his camels water and things. So this is the Revised English Bible. So this is even more recent than the King James Bible. It says here, she went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. Abraham's servant hurried to meet her and said, "Will you give me a little water from your jar?" "Please drink, sir," she answered, and at once lowered her jar on her hand to let him drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I shall draw water also for your camels until they have had enough." She quickly emptied her jar into the water trough, and then hurrying again to the well, she drew water and watered all the camels. So that's a more revised English translation, basically. It's a little more transactional. So this author, I believe his last name is Altair, at least that's how we're pronouncing it in class. he goes back to the ancient Hebrew and then translates from the ancient Hebrew. In ancient Hebrew, there is a word, the vav. It's a I don't want to say a vowel necessarily, but I think it is kind of like that. It's like the and symbol basically. So that has been taken out of translation in a lot of ways. They took that part out, and so he's kept it in this ancient Hebrew. So he's trying to do more of a literal from Hebrew to English translation. So here's, if in a literal translation, here's how those same verses would sound. And she came down to the spring and filled her jug and came back up. And the servant ran toward her and said, "Pray, let me sip a bit of water from your jug." And she said, "Drink, my lord." And she hurried and tipped down her jug on one hand and let him drink. And she let him drink his fill and said, "For your camels too I shall draw water until they drink their fill." And she hurried and emptied her jug into the trough, and she ran again to the well to draw water and drew water for all his camels. Now, one thing you're going to see right off the bat is there's a lot of ands in there. I think he counted, there's like 16 ands in that, whereas the English version had like 5. So that's the particle vav, I think is what it is in Hebrew. They kind of like, oh, I wouldn't need that many ands. In English, it just sounds weird to have that many ands. So we're going to cut a lot of that out. But if you think about it, there is a sense of urgency that comes across in the Hebrew that isn't there in the English. And so the English sounds a little bit more transactional, whereas the Hebrew actually has a little bit more sense of an urgency. There's an emotion in there. Oh, I got to hurry. Let me help you out. Let me take care of you. Let me make sure you're taken care of. That's different. So we're learning some phenomenal stuff in this class. Absolutely amazing. That is so cool. So this is a fun book that we're getting into. In fact, we spent a lot of time talking about Cain. We're still talking about Cain more, but in the story of Cain, we're looking at this from literary standpoints, from historical standpoints, about the story of Cain. So if you're not familiar with this, in the chapter 4 of the book of Genesis, Cain is a son of Adam and Eve. He has a brother named Abel, and they offer sacrifices. Abel becomes a shepherd. He raises animals, whereas Cain becomes what they call a tiller of the ground. He becomes a gardener. He grows vegetables and fruits. When they're giving their sacrifice to God that they were instructed to by their parents, Abel gives an animal sacrifice. He gives, as it says, the fat of his the firstlings of his flock, the fat of them, basically. So he takes the best animal, and that's what he gives to God. Whereas Cain is giving vegetables to God. And so he says that the challenge is, there's a lot of challenge and debate between, well, what was the real problem here? What was really going on between these two? Because God, after they give their sacrifice, God warns Cain not to be frustrated with his sacrifice and with what's going on. And we talked about how it says in there, sin lieth at the door. Now, when you look at these words of sin lieth at the door, it translates as if there is a being lying in wait to catch you. So in ways we could think about this as like the devil is waiting to catch Cain in sin, basically. He's trying to trick him and catch him in a temptation. But then we learn that there is like God is warning Cain about this. So God's not condemning Cain because of his offering. So some people look at this and say, is there a debate in this offering to say that animal sacrifice is worth more than a vegetable sacrifice to God? Maybe that's what it is. Maybe all Cain had to do was use some of his vegetables to buy an animal. Some people look at that idea of sin lieth at the door, because Hebrew, when you translate Hebrew, each word can mean a bunch of different meanings. So you have to look at it in the context of everything else to try to understand which one of those meanings is the one that's appropriate for it. Some people think that when God said sin lieth at the door is a mistranslation, and that it was showing there was an animal lying there near Cain that he could have taken to use as a sacrifice. So a little bit of an emphasis more on an animal sacrifice than a plant sacrifice, more of the idea of doing the ordinance properly type idea. But also more likely, as we talked about, that it's more appropriate to think about this as Abel put his whole heart into the sacrifice. Cain was sacrificing because he had to. He was told to. So he was acting religious, whereas Abel was truly religious inside. And maybe that's where that debate comes from in there. So when we look at these stories, there's a whole lot of richness and things, these questions that come in that unfortunately there's a lot of parts of the story that aren't in there in the Bible. So we're getting lots of bits and pieces of a bigger story, which allows us to speculate, to think, and wonder what about these types of ideas and concepts that happened with that story. And some people even argue that that's the point. When the authors of the book of Genesis put it together, they put it together in a way to leave certain facts out to allow certain other facts to stand forward. Sometimes people talk about that with the idea that women were not seen in there. We don't hear of the women that Cain and Abel married, which goes back to the idea of, even though we learn of the birth of Cain and we learn of the birth of Abel. Now, how it's worded, when Cain is born, Eve makes a statement, I have partnered with God to have a baby. I have a baby. And then that just says that Abel was born next. So some people look at that and go, maybe Cain and Abel were twins. Cain was the first born and then Abel came out second. We don't know. There's other traditions out there. I know I've read in some of the pseudepigraphical writings that mention that Cain and Abel were twins, but their twins were girls. And so they married each other's female twin to have for children, basically. That's who they married. Because we don't hear about it. All we hear is at some point after Cain gets kicked out, he and his family leave. Where did his wife come from? We don't know. So that detail's not there. Other traditions talk about Adam and Eve had more children than just Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel were the only two they talked about at the time. Because where did all these people come that end up following Cain down into the valley? The Nod or nomadism. How did they get there? What happened? Was there another group down there? Was this the other family, other children of Adam and Eve that left and followed Cain? And they were left up themselves alone, so they had another kid named Seth and started the righteous generation over again. There's a lot of what ifs because the Bible doesn't give us a lot of that detail. And so that's some of the fun things that we've been talking about in this book is as we examine the wording and the historicity of this, what does that mean? What can they help us out? What really is there in the writings and what isn't there? And what do both of those tell us and inform us about these stories and what's going on? So as we go through, we're going to do, another chapter 2 a week in this, it sounds like. So we'll keep talking about some of these ideas. It's just so fascinating, absolutely fascinating. One thing I wanted to put out here, there is a sentence when Cain and Abel are talking, after this conversation that Cain has with God. We never hear a conversation with Abel and God. We only hear this conversation of Cain and God. But after this, all we hear is Cain and Abel were out in the fields and Cain killed Abel. In the ancient text, in the Greek, the Syriac, and the Aramaic versions, we have this word, the phrase, let us go out to the field. So Cain asks Abel, hey Abel, let's go out to the field. Let's go out to do our stuff. And so Abel follows Cain out to the field. That phrase is not found in the English translations. It's not in the Masoretic texts that the English translations were based upon or a major part of. So this author talks about that in the Hebrew, it's there, which is much older than the English translations. But in the English translations, because they're more the Masoretic texts, it's not there. So it's interesting that, again, there's a piece missing even out of the Masoretic texts that the King James Version was based on, that all the other ones are usually based on as well. So a lot of fascinating things that are happening with this. So a lot of cool stuff in that class that we've talked about. So we have our 3000 level class. In my 3000 level class, this is the historical research class. So we're not just reading and looking at how can we evaluate, what methods can we use to understand the ancient writings with. This is more about how to think like a historian. So in this book, The Landscape of History, How Historians Map the Past, this is a great book that I've talked about, again, a couple weeks ago. Some cool points of how to be a historian. So I want to read a couple of these quotes to you to just let you to think about. This is when you think about history, here's some ideas to think about. He said here, for if you think of the past as a landscape, then history is the way we represent it. And it's that act of representation that lifts us above the familiar to let us experience vicariously what we can't experience directly, which is a wider view. Now imagine a historical event, okay? If you went back in time to that historical event, you wouldn't experience all the things that happened in that event. All you'd experience is your experience of being at that event. So what you would get out of it, some people talk about, and he brings this up in his book, that some people talk about this idea of, oh, historians wish we could build a time machine to go back in time and actually be there and examine what really happens. The problem is if you build a time machine and go back, all you're going to see is your experience of what happened. So historians take the experience of multiple perspectives to pull this together. So historians actually end up having a better perspective of what happened in the past than the people that were in the past. If you were a Jew in the 1940s in Germany, you saw a very terrible experience in your life. Lots of pain, lots of suffering, lots of problems, lots of hate against you. If you were a German in the 1940s, you saw a hard life that you were told was because of the Jews. So you hated the Jews. If you're in America in the 1940s, you had a decent life, but there were challenges in the world. But your life was somewhat insulated from all that. So what's interesting is each of these different people only saw their own perspective. But a historian looking back can take all these perspectives and weave them together into understanding different lessons, different ideas of the past that the individuals might not have ever picked up. Even in your own life, if you look at some major event that's happened in your life, you remember your perspective of what you were doing in that moment. But it wasn't till later, when you could gain perspective of a lot of different people, that you started to understand what really was going on. So that's where we get with history. And historians are pulling from lots of different perspectives to understand better what's going on. That does not mean, and he mentions that in here, I'll see if I can find that quote, that doesn't mean historians are telling the truth about what there was. What it means is historians are making sense of what's there and coming up with different perspectives of what happened based upon what the methodology they're using to research, whether it was historical or liturgical or literary or other things like that, or reception history, those kinds of things. So historians are looking for a perspective of history. They get pretty darn close to the truth of what really happened, but they can't say 100% for sure that that's exactly what happened because they weren't there. There could have been nuances. There could have been little things that were missed. There could have been stuff that happened that never got wrote down, conversations that were verbal that never got written down anywhere that could have changed how we think about that event. So it's the same as like building a case in a court situation. We can't build the exact truth of what actually happened. All we can do is say, based upon the evidence, here's what we think did happen. And then use that to make an assessment on whether that person's innocent or guilty. So that's what he talks about here. So he says, there's another gentleman, last name of Carr, wrote a book, What is History? And he said, Carr was making a larger and less controversial argument, that if we can widen the range of experience beyond what we as individuals have encountered, if we can draw upon the experiences of others who had to confront comparable situations in the past, then, although there are no guarantees, our chances of acting wisely should increase proportionally. So if we can learn from the past and not make those mistakes in the future is a valuable asset in our learning and in what we're doing. So, here's that quote. It says, it's part of historical consciousness to learn the same thing. There is no correct interpretation of the past, but that the act of interpreting is itself a vicarious enlargement of experience from which you can benefit. So when we can take an experience of the past and see it from multiple perspectives, we gain a better idea of what was really going on, what was happening. And that's the beauty of history, is we can learn from multiple ideas. That's important for us. It is to interpret the past for the purpose of the present, with a view to managing the future, but to do so without suspending the capacity to assess the particular circumstances in which one might have to act, or the relevance of past actions to them. To accumulate experience is not to endorse its automatic application, for part of historical consciousness is the ability to see differences as well as similarities, to understand that generalizations do not always hold in particular circumstances. So studying the past is no sure guide to predicting the future. What it does do, though, is to prepare you for the future by expanding experience, so that you can increase your skills, your stamina, and if all goes well, your wisdom. So that's this challenge they have. So we can't, when recreating the past, all we're doing is recreating what we think was the past, because we weren't literally there. So in some ways, historians can see, here's some things that were literally there because there's proof of it, and here's the things that we have to conceptualize were there because we don't have proof of it. And he says that that's striking that balance between these two is a common challenge that historians have to deal with, the abstract and the reality, to understand what was really going on. So this is the study of history. This is how historians think and work. So we're going to get more into that as we go through the rest of his writings in this class as well. How do we think? How do we evaluate what we're doing to make sense of stuff? In fact, we had an example. It was really kind of a fun one to do in our class this week. Our teacher gave us this PDF that had like 7 things that came out of the Revolutionary War. So one was like a newspaper article. Several were the cartoons, editorial cartoons that were published in America and in England about the colonies and England and things. Some of them were depictions of battles, like the massacre at Boston that happened. And so we had to take these pieces of information and build a narrative to explain what happened between around 1760 to 1776. And it's been really fun to do that. So we got to put our own narrative together and kind of build it. I took more of a chronological aspect of what was the years that each of these things came out, and let's put that in place and then talk about them. One thing that's interesting in here is there was a letter from Abigail Adams, I want to say. Oh man, what was her last name now? It could have been Abigail Adams, so it would have been John Adams' wife. When they were putting the Constitution together, when they were talking about independence in 1776, before the war was over, so they're confident in winning at this point. They've done well. They've won several big battles against the British. It's turned into something where they feel confident they could win. The talk of independence started to come out in the colonies. They were preparing to develop the laws to be a sovereign nation once they got this war over with. In her letter, she wrote to her husband, who had been gone, dealing with all the challenges of trying to build a new nation in the middle of fighting this war. Her letter is a fascinating letter because it talks about the discussion of independence and things that were happening at the time. But she also puts in there a recommendation to her husband. She basically says, while you're writing these laws and getting things set up for how this new nation's going to work, I want you to think about us women. And I want you to write the laws to give us more equality in what's going on. We don't like how it's been in the past. We'd like to have more equality. It's fascinating that letter's there because they didn't get that much more equality. I think a little bit more than what they had in England, but not a ton more. And so they didn't probably go as the founding fathers didn't go as far as the women probably wanted them to. But it's fascinating that letter was there, that a woman was asking for more freedoms and rights in 1776. And at the beginning, they were hoping, a lot of women, it sounds like, were hoping that these men that were putting the rules together would grant more equality for women at the time. And it didn't quite happen. It happened a little bit from what they had in the past. They did get a little better, but not a lot better. And so it'd take a lot longer for women to reach that equality they have today. So that was kind of a fun little thing to see in that class as well, as we had to think critically about these pieces and figure out how do they fit into a bigger narrative, and what is that narrative and what does that say about the Revolutionary War. So that was kind of fun to go through that exercise. So my last class, my interfaith class, I'm really excited for this class. Chad Ford is the professor of this class. If you look him up, the guy's got a ton of amazing experience in dealing with not negotiations, but helping people resolve problems. So he'll take two groups that are at odds with each other, and he will deal with the conflict in between them. So conflict resolution stuff. The guy's amazing at it. He's got a great reputation for it. So really cool stuff in that class. This week in that class, we talked about what is the difference between being spiritual versus being religious. That's the thing that we discussed. We had a paper that's an article that he had us read where it's somebody talking about these two ideas, and we had to offer our opinions and ideas on them. So for the sake of this discussion, spiritual is when somebody feels a connection, a personal connection with God. When they feel that connection with the infinite, personally within themselves, that is spiritual. Religious is defined as an organization that you're a part of that is doing things to come closer to God and do what God wants. So there's this contrast, and this is a big deal because in today's society, and he went through the Pew Research. You can go if you go Pew Research Religious Studies, you'll find all kinds of data about how. So Pew is a company that does studies. They ask people survey questions, they pull the data together and try to make sense of the data. They've done this for years, and they've asked religious questions for a long time. You can go look at the data and see trends of what's been happening in America religiously. They're seeing a trend. More and more people are becoming less religious, but more spiritual. So they believe in God, they're connecting with God, but they're not putting their faith through an organized religion. This is a big trend we're seeing in the world. And even in Jana Reese's book, The Next Mormon, she talks a little bit about this when she's interviewing millennials and trying to understand millennial Mormons and what does that mean for Mormonism, which we've discussed that back in the fall semester. So this is an interesting distinction that we're separating out, that you can have a connection with God without having an organized religion that you're a part of. And so this is just fascinating to see that. Now, what does that mean? What is the implications of that? That's a whole nother ball of wax. But this is a big trend that's happening. And so what does that mean for us, and how do we need to think about in talking with people about what is spiritual and what is religious? I looked at it from the standpoint of, spiritual is important. We need a connection with God personally. That's what a testimony is that personal connection with God. In fact, the book of Revelations tells us that your personal relationship with Christ is actually called the spirit of revelation. The closer to Christ you have that, the more personal your relationship is with Christ, the more revelation you have. You can gain, you can learn from the Spirit more. So that's spiritualism, okay? Sometimes people are spiritual, but not religious. Sometimes people are religious, but not spiritual. They go to church, they act the part, they do the ordinances, they perform the callings, but they have no real connection to God. And in my article, my response to this was, you need both. You need to do both in your life. And it's the dynamic, the tension between both of them is where you can find truth. So ordinances are important. Following the commandments, organizing with the saints, being a part of Zion and the saints is important. The scriptures tell us religion is important, but the scriptures also tell us our personal connection to Christ is just as important. So while we're being involved in a religion, we're also seeking a personal connection to Christ, which doesn't involve the religion as much. The religion really should be supporting our ability to have that personal connection to Christ, because it's the personal connection to Christ, that faith in Christ, is what allows the atonement to work in our life. So religion should support spirituality, but sometimes it doesn't. And so this is the challenge we have. And so it's this tension between these two that is where we find truth and growth and opportunities, like the idea of that the contraries that Joseph Smith talks about. It's in proving contraries that truth is found. So that's the direction I went, thinking that, it is important to have both. Have one without the other is going to be a problem. You can't go to church without acting spiritual and have it work. And you can't be spiritual without having the church there to help you. So they go hand in hand, and we need to work together on those. So that was fun. So if you want to put in the comments what you think about these ideas yourself, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. And we'll see you next week as we go to week 2 of spring semester.